Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Nick. And thank you, everyone, for coming to my talk at this late hour of the day. I'm going to talk on STEM education, but with a primary focus on mathematics education. This is where I'm from, way down under in Brisbane, and you can just see some images of what Brisbane is like. So I just thought I'd talk about what is STEM education, some of the controversies. Is there a crisis in STEM education? Looking at STEM literacy, what can we do to elevate mathematics education within STEM, and then just a few concluding points. I thought I'd start off and just mention that we look at Asia, I know in Australia and probably in the US as well, you think, well, the Asian countries are doing very well in the international comparison assessments and so on, we'll have to copy them. But in actual fact, from what my reading is that what Asia's high-performing systems have to offer the world is not their past, but the future they intend to create. It is their vision of a new education and the courage to make changes to long-held traditions. So contrary to what we think some of the Asian countries are doing, they really are advancing some of the ideas that I'll be talking about today and the focus on 21st century skills. Well, I don't know about, I presume this in the US you have this STEM fad, or this STEM crisis. In Australia, everything's STEM. And my research in STEM area, I focus a lot on what is happening in the US. But the National Science Foundation, which you're probably obviously familiar with, but the notion of the acronym STEM was coined way back in the 1990s by the respective disciplinarians to try and create a stronger political force. And the STEM Task Force report came out of California a couple of years ago, and I do quote a lot from that because it's a really good report. You're not familiar with it. Why is there a STEM emergency? Now, our chief scientist in Australia, who's been replaced recently because he's retired, but he was often quoted, STEM is the core of almost every agenda and a preoccupation now shaping the world's plans. The jobs of the future are STEM jobs. The Committee on STEM Education here in the US. And we hear repeatedly commentators saying STEM competencies are increasingly needed not only within but outside the STEM occupations. So really in Australia, and I assume in the US, everything is STEM. There's a STEM crisis. The issue is, do we have a global shortage of STEM people, an interest in STEM? One author, Charrett, pronounce his name, says it's just a myth. Yet the Royal Society Science Policy Centre in the UK says there is a lack of suitable STEM employees and estimate that we need 1 million plus more. So different countries are emphasising different things. Some say there isn't a shortage, others say there are. But still, the notion of STEM crisis is in Australia and I presume in the US as well. So where is the STEM crisis lying? Well, there are conflicting perspectives on STEM, and people talk about STEM, but all they refer to is, say, science. I'm finding that there's inequitable discipline focus, and I think there's a discipline wars when it comes to STEM. And I believe there aren't any science educators here, because I would hate to offend any science educators, but I think when they talk about STEM, at least in Australia, they refer to science. You know, forget about mathematics and forget about engineering, but I'll come back to that. But where is the crisis? Well, one argument is it's in the STEM literacy. Students are not receiving a solid foundation in the STEM. Another problem is the STEM perspectives. We don't have a globally accepted definition of STEM. Now, I have been reading a lot on the California Department of Education, mainly because when I was doing my research, they seem to be quite progressive in some of their reports. So they look at STEM and they offer a range of perspectives, identify individual subjects, a standalone course, a sequence of courses, STEM-related course, an interconnected or integrated program of study. Then you get your generic perspectives. STEM involves your 21st century skills, which we hear advocated all the time: critical thinking, problem solving, inquiry processes, design processes and teamwork. Now, I'm a great believer in these. They've been around for a number of years, obviously, but they lend themselves to a range of fields. But in mathematics, they lend themselves very well, particularly to modelling, which is what I'm going to focus on. And coming back to the STEM Task Force report, they strongly encourage integration of the STEM disciplines. They argue the whole is more than the sum of the parts, and they say that STEM education is more than just a convenient integration. And they claim that the disciplines cannot and should not be taught in isolation, just as they do not exist in isolation in the real world. So we've not only got different interpretations of what STEM means from the different disciplines, but you've also got the notion of integration, which I'll come back to. I like MikeShaughnessy's definition. He did a brief article when he was president of NCTM in, I think it was mathematics teaching in the middle school, and he made very pertinent points, saying that STEM education refers to solving problems that draw on concepts and procedures from mathematics and science, while incorporating the teamwork and design methodology of engineering and using appropriate technology. So I'll come back to Mike's definitions. Now, I feel that there is an inequitable discipline focus, particularly in Australia, I think. I think STEM refers to science, and I'm glad there are any science educators here. I know science is very important, and I hope we can say science covers mathematics as well and covers everything else. But I know with my interest in mathematics education, which I came, in engineering education, which I came through via modelling and linking mathematics and science, but engineering gets neglected and the science educators feel they cover a lot. I think mathematics gets neglected to some extent, particularly when they're referring to STEM as a whole. We've got to be careful that maths doesn't lose its focus in engineering. There's a STEM and Education conference held every couple of years. The last one in Vancouver, the next one is in Beijing in China this year, and I couldn't get the proportion of papers, but you can see that the conference was on STEM, but 45% of the papers were on science, 12% technology, only 9% engineering, and 16% mathematics. So STEM conferences from my experience, tend to be dominated by science. But with this focus on computational thinking and coding, science and mathematics are becoming computational endeavours. So the computational coding people like to take over, like to look at mathematics as well. Okay. So where is the status of maths education within STEM? Well, we talk about STEM education in schools aims for broad-based literacy, science for all. That's one quote that we hear. Where's the mathematics for all? And there's a very good report put out by some Australian authors, Marginson, who's now in the UK, looking at cross-country comparisons of STEM education, and he argued the stage of mathematics for all should be shifted further up the educational scale. Coming back to MikeShaughnessy, he says, now and I think his words are very important, beware of programs that are merely a STEM veneer, that is, where approaches do not genuinely integrate the disciplines and thus may be devoid of important learning in mathematics. STEM education must involve significant mathematics for students, otherwise the M in STEM is silence. And likewise, I would say the E in STEM is just there to make the acronym sound nice because it gets ignored as well. But the engineering fits in beautifully with mathematics and science. So looking at STEM literacy, the California STEM Task Force report, they looked at STEM literacy and they looked at maths, at science, technology, engineering and mathematics, and they looked at what to be STEM literate, what you have to accomplish in each of the respective disciplines. So when it comes to mathematics, they claimed that mathematically literate students not only know how to analyse, reason and communicate ideas in mathematics, they can also mathematically pose, model, formulate, solve and interpret questions and solutions in the other disciplines. Now, PISA in 2015, you focus a fair bit, do you, on the PISA results and so on? We tend to in Australia, but mathematical literacy is very important in the PISA documents, and that's their definition there, and they focus on reasoning mathematically, using mathematical concepts, procedures, facts and tools to describe, explain and predict phenomena. I noticed in their recent report they've got 4 content categories that they'll be testing students on: change in relationships, space and shape, quantity and uncertainty in data. What I'm going to have a look at in the remainder of my activity slides today is the uncertainty in data and statistics, which is what I've been researching for a number of years, but mainly in the elementary and middle school. I'm not by no means an expert at quite sophisticated mathematics. I'm not, but I like to introduce statistics right down into the grade 1 classes, because young children can handle statistics at an elementary level very effectively. Uncertainty in data. Now, the Royal Society of Science in the UK looks at the core role of mathematics is analysing and reasoning with data to make informed decisions and engage in constructive debate about local and global issues. And I think that's so important in statistics in this day and age, when we're fed with statistics all the time, that we become critical consumers. So if we're going to elevate mathematics within STEM, which I always try to do, I don't like mathematics being neglected, obviously, when we talk about STEM, is that I try and I'm looking at elevating mathematics through modelling with data. And what I'll be looking at in some examples from engineering-based problems, a couple of examples there, and then developing statistical literacy. Well, my definition of modelling with data across STEM is I look at it as a process of inquiry involving comprehensive statistical reasoning that draws upon the STEM-based concepts, contexts and questions. And because statistics cuts right across your STEM disciplines, it's an ideal vehicle for advancing mathematical learning and modelling across the disciplines. And with this modelling with data, students create products or models that are supported by the evidence and that are open to informal inferential reasoning. That is, they can use their model to describe, to explain, to predict. So just informal inferential reasoning. This is just, I fiddle with a lot of these diagrams when it comes to modelling with data and also engineering education, because the engineering design process lends itself very nicely to modelling problems in mathematics as well. So this is just one diagram that I've developed, where looking at interpreting, understanding the problem, where you've got the context, the goal, what are the constraints. In engineering education, there are a number of constraints and criteria the students have to look at. In mathematical modelling, there can be certain constraints and criteria as well. Posing and refining questions are a very important aspect in statistics and in modelling. Organising data, selecting it, eliminating, prioritising, generating some mathematics, developing a model, structuring it, representing it, refining it, and drawing some inferences. That's a modelling cycle that I've been looking at in my mathematical modelling with students right from early ages up into the middle school. And I find students will go through that, and it's amazing what students can do with data and the mathematics they can draw out of that before they've been taught it. These are just some of the common mathematisation processes you'd be very familiar with, but I encourage interpreting, generating mathematics, communicating it, representing it, documenting it, reporting it. They're very important features in the mathematical modelling. Going back to the PISA, now it's interesting, they have identified 4 context categories that they are focusing on in their items that they're going to test students on, looking at personal, for example, health, economic and so on, occupational aspects, hiring staff, etc., society, and scientific. Okay, so what I thought I'd give you some examples of activities that I've done, also that my colleague in Cyprus has done, where we've looked at modelling with statistics. First of all, these examples are just based on engineering, looking at two examples: rebuilding the 35th West Minneapolis Bridge and a severe water shortage in Cyprus. My colleague in Cyprus, I've been working in with him. He's been implementing we've been creating activities together. He's implemented some in Cyprus, and some of the activities that I've implemented in Australia, he's implemented over there, and vice versa. One activity he did with students in grade 6, which are 11-year-olds, was exploring the collapse of the bridge in Minnesota and how we're going to go about choosing a bridge to replace it. But before I look at that, I just want to touch upon engineering-based modelling with data. Now, the engineering design features in your next generation science standards and also features in our design and technologies program in Australia. And with my work in engineering, we do engineering-based problems, but the design process is foundational, and it's also foundational in some of the engineering-based modelling that I've been doing as well. So in the next generation science standards, they say that all citizens should develop engineering design practices by defining problems, by specifying constraints and criteria, generating and evaluating possible solutions, and optimising the solution by systematically testing and revising. We have a new Australian curriculum. One of them is, we've got maths, science, literacy and so on. We do have a new curriculum on technologies. There's design and technologies, where they look at critiquing, analysing, investigating, creating solutions, and they also focus on engineering principles. So this engineering education and engineering design is coming more into our curriculum in Australia and in your next generation science standards. I really like the next generation science standards. I actually prefer them to ours. So getting back to this first problem, the students had to look at rebuilding the 35th West Bridge in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the students were given a newspaper article about the history of the bridge, a video clip of the collapse, a problem scenario about the bridge, what they had to accomplish, and they were given 2 tables of data. So the scenario was that the Minnesota Public Works Department urgently needs to construct a new bridge in the same location. The bridge was to comprise a highway with a length of approximately 1,000 feet with a deck of 4 lanes with additional side lanes. Your assistance is required in creating a way or a model for comparing the different bridge types to choose the most appropriate one to build across each of the spans. The students were given 2 tables. The first table was the characteristics of the 4 major bridge types: the truss bridge, which is what the Minnesota, the bridge was there, the truss bridge, an arch bridge, suspension, and the cable stayed, and the advantages and the disadvantages, the span range, the material and design effort. So there you're bringing in your engineering ideas, and the next one, so they've got those aspects, and here's just some examples here. The first one is a truss bridge over there in France. The one to the right there is a suspension bridge in Charleston. The one over there is in China, and because you know that one, Brooklyn, New York. The students were given a second table, which they also had to use to generate a model for reconstructing the bridge. They were given, and these were examples from the US, the Hennepin Avenue. Do you know where that is? Yes, in Minneapolis, apparently. The Golden Gate, of course, 10th Avenue. So they were given examples of 2 suspension bridges, 2 arch, 2 cable stayed, and 2 truss. They were given the total length and the car lanes. You'll notice some variation. The arch one, for example, had a bike and pedestrian only. How difficult were they to construct? Easy, whatever. What was the cost? So the students had to use that information as well as the first one, which looked at the advantages and disadvantages of the different bridge types, and to develop their own model. And they also came up with how many lanes they might have in their model. So they're just some examples that they explored. And the students also did their own research on bridges as well as part of this activity. So what the model they had to develop included calculating the costs for each of the bridge types. So there was the cost calculation, and their model had to enable them to select the best possible bridge type for the reconstruction. They had to take into account the bridge type, the materials to be used, the design of the bridge, safety issues, and the cost factors. Now see, these are some of the factors the students considered in developing their models. How much it cost per surface unit of the deck, the aesthetics of the different bridge types, design effort, how difficult were they to design, how difficult were they to construct, the length of them, and width. Now I'll just show you a couple of examples. This first model, the students didn't take all of the factors into account, but they started off, and these are students working in groups, and they argued that a cable-stayed bridge was best to build because it's very, very quick. And then they said, well, suspension bridge is expensive, so they decided they'd develop a cost model for each type of bridge using those tables. Student one said a cable-stayed bridge is the best choice. It can be built fast, it's a beautiful one, it's not very expensive, like the suspension bridge. And then they said, well, now the suspension bridge has the same characteristics. It is not more expensive. And the students were arguing, and my colleague in Cyprus has translated the students from the Greek into English. So the students are saying, hang on, we're in a bit of a mess here. We're not going to make much progress. We're going to argue like this. Let's get down and get things first. We cannot compare them as they are because they're not the same. Looking at the bridges, they realised the variation in the data that was given. So they developed a simple division model. They divided the cost by the total length of each bridge and then calculated the average cost for each bridge. Something is wrong. This is not reasonable. Why not? Well, how do you know it's not correct? Well, we took into account the length, but there are big bridges with many lanes and also ones for pedestrians. This is the problem. This is, we start. Exactly, we need to use the length and the number of lanes. So they created a model for the cost using both the length and the width of the bridge, and they referred to money or cost per square foot. Then they had difficulties in calculating which of the bridges, as the data referred to the car lanes. So they decided they would make the typical lane width of 12 feet and the estimated width of the bike and pedestrian bridges, they made 30 feet. So they developed an improved model with a cable-stayed bridge chosen as the least expensive. But they didn't question the great variation between the different bridge types. And so they came up with a limited model, but they didn't take into account all of the factors there. And so this, whether you've got the 30 there, that refers to the length of the bike and the pedestrian. So that was what they came up with there. Now then, another group looked at taking into account mathematical, engineering and societal factors. Now they started off and they weren't going to consider a truss-type bridge because the bridge that collapsed was a truss one. And we should not choose this one because if we selected the truss bridge, it would make people feel insecure and bring back all those bad memories. So they decided that they then progressed to determining a cost model and ranking each of the bridge types. So they realised there was variation in the cost for the bridges of the same type. We need to take into account more factors. Our calculations are correct, but there is nothing wrong. The cost is very different. There are other things that are important that we have to consider. For example, bridges that are close to the sea, they reckon was more difficult. Yes, like the Golden Gate Bridge is difficult. It's so expensive and not that long. Then they realised the cost is not proportionally related to the surface of the bridge, the deck, but also the level of difficulty. Just like the Golden Gate, So they looked back at Table 1, which showed the advantages and disadvantages of the bridge types, and they couldn't really determine a recommended bridge type from the first table, so they decided they would consider further factors, and they looked at extra lanes for bridges, bikes and pedestrians, how difficult it was. And so they came up with a more advanced model where they actually listed the length, the lanes, the bikes, extra lanes, the total deck surface, the cost, constructability, and cost per square feet. So this is a more advanced one. And they came up with the ranking of cable-stayed, arch, truss, and suspension bridge. But then they had concerns about the stability of the cable-stayed bridges for long bridge spans. So you've got your engineering features coming in there. So they finally decided they would choose the arch type. That was the model that they came up with. Okay, so I'll just quickly go through. So that was an example at looking at bridge building, but based on mathematics dealing with data, but bringing in engineering, design factors, materials, society factors, emotional factors as well. This is another one. There's a severe water shortage in Cyprus, and the students were given a modelling problem where they had to help the Cyprus Water Board decide which country to import water from. Because they have such water shortage in Cyprus, they've got to import water from the neighbouring countries. And they were given this information, but they also found further information themselves on the internet, whatever. So they were given the countries, Egypt, Greece, Lebanon, Syria, the water supply per week, the water price, the tanker capacity, oil cost, and port facilities. That was another issue. How effective were the port facilities? Some students chose to ignore the port facilities. Other groups took that into account. And so this is the first model where they used the Google Earth to determine distances. They excluded some data, and they came up with a pretty simple model where they exclude, I think, the cost of water was some of the things that they ignored the port facilities and the water supply per week. But a more advanced model, they took into account the port facilities, the water supply, the tanker capacity, the oil cost, and energy consumption. And their question, when they were working their model, they said, well, what would be the cost of improving the port's facilities? If we take that into account, how will that change the water price per tonne? Then they said, which factor is more important, water price or oil consumption? So here we've got environmental science issues coming into play. They were concerned about water consumption. And they decided that it would be better for a country to spend a little more money and reduce the oil consumption. So they didn't necessarily go for the cheapest one, because they were concerned about environmental issues like the pollution of the Mediterranean Sea, and they proposed Syria as the best place to buy. Okay, so now moving to a different example, looking at statistical literacy, where students were exploring the Olympic Games, and then they were doing modelling based on Olympic data. So this is just another example of how I've brought in statistics, but from a different angle. So you can see that we're focusing on variation, making predictions, exploring and forming decisions involving uncertainty. With this, this particular activity I implemented with 6th grade students, and they'd worked through a data modelling statistics program from grade 4, 5 and 6. And by the time they reached year 6, they were pretty good at investigations, at posing questions, at being critical consumers of statistics, at undertaking investigations, and we could see their learning develop across the 3 years, which was rewarding to us. So they were used to posing and refining questions, which are not easy. Now in our dissertations, when we do our dissertations, posing and refining your questions can be one of the hardest things, because you've got to make sure your questions, you can get data to answer your questions. And this was something the students came to realise. They were analysing and representing their data, making a decision, acknowledging uncertainty. When we're dealing with statistics, there's a certain amount of uncertainty. But unfortunately, we tend to, particularly with the media, blast us with statistics all the time. We just accept it without realising there's a certain amount of uncertainty there. So our first part of this series of lessons was looking at the broad question, are athletes getting better over time? And we were leading towards the Rio 2016 Olympics. And we looked at some videos and studied the performance of Usain Bolt. So we actually gave the students this question, are athletes getting better over time? We said, is that a very good question? What's wrong with it? And they realised I'm pretty good after, 3 years. Students said, well, what do you mean by athletes? What are you referring to? What do you mean by getting better? Because getting better can refer to different aspects. What do you mean over time? 5 years, 10 years, right since the history of the Olympics? So the students had to refine their statistical questions. Then they had to consider what's the appropriate data. Okay, they refined their question and they had to decide what data are we going to gather? Where are we going to locate it? Will the data answer our question? Because oftentimes it won't. How confident are we going to be in drawing conclusions? Will we have to refine our questions further? And we actually gave the students data sets of the Olympic gold medal results. Ideally, we would like students to find the data themselves, but within the framework, because I always work in with teachers and make sure that these activities fit in with their curriculum, because we don't want these activities to be seen as add-on and they think, oh God, here comes Lynn again, we've got to make time for her activities. That's the last thing I want. And so I want them, so we fit in with their curriculum and their themes. And in Australia, we're pretty sports mad, particularly when it comes to Olympics. We weren't too happy being beaten by the US, but anyway, that's always the way. So we gave the students 12 sets of data with freestyle, sprint, running, high and long jump events, and that's just one example. And we had, as you can see, starting right back from 1896, the results, the name, the countries. So they had that and they explored that data. Actually, some of them did want to. They had their laptops and they wanted to explore further, and they said, well, so we encouraged them to do that at home. But it was great to see them wanting to do further exploration. But of course, time constraints is always a problem. We also gave them, because we were working with Tinkerplots as well, which graphing software, we gave them some results in a graph as well. We asked the students to, before this modelling problem, we asked the students to represent the data, to explore the data, come up with a conclusion, just sketch it initially, because while Tinkerplots is a good program, I think that it's limiting if it's introduced too early. Now, my Tasmanian colleague down the bottom part of Australia, she and I, we get on really well most of the time, except that she loves Tinkerplots and she always does the... and I like Tinkerplots too, but I like students to be able to create their own representations. I find that Tinkerplots can be a bit limiting. So, it's amazing what representations students will come up with. I've had grade 1 kids and grade 2 kids wanting to draw pie graphs, circle graphs, which they do quite well. They've never been taught, and circle graphs are not exactly easy, to break up into sectors, but little kids want to do it, and they can do it amazingly. So we asked them to, what does your representation tell you? How does it help you answer your question? How could you improve your representation? And this is some example of a hand-drawn plot. We said to them, just, use your scale, but don't, sometimes if you give them, say we want a hand-drawn representation, they'll take ages, drawing it neatly and anything. We said, look, just sketch it, please, otherwise we'll be there all day. One used the Tinkerplots and did a hat plot. And what did they, some examples that they reported on. Our representation shows us that 100-metre sprinters are generally becoming faster since 1972. It is a gentle decline from 10.14 seconds to 9.63 seconds of the London 2012 Olympic Games. However, during the 1980 Moscow Olympic Games, someone with a time of 24 seconds, which is a distinct outlier. So outlier was something that we had taught the students. And said our representation helped us with our answer, as it shows a clear trend of quicker times. We could improve our representation if we made the y-axis, the times, more specific to show the exact times. And we wanted the students to look at their analysis and draw a conclusion, acknowledging uncertainty. And we were encouraging them to look at the uncertainty of the conclusion. How certain can you be? What evidence do you have to support your conclusion? That's pretty important, because as a journal editor, and the same with me writing papers, even I'm guilty of it. When we have a discussion and conclusions at the end, you will say things and reviewers will come back and say, hang on, how can you draw that conclusion? Where's your evidence? I can't see the evidence in the data that you report in your study, and think, I've made claims that I shouldn't have. So the students realise that they have to have evidence to draw their conclusions. And how certain are you of that? And one example, we've come to the conclusion that 100-metre sprinters have become quicker from 1972 to 2012. Our graph has clearly shown the trend of quicker times for the gold medalists. Another one says our graphs show a gentle decline. We're not extremely certain of our conclusion. This is because our time frame does not include all of the Olympic Games, which officially started in 1896, so we can't really say that athletes are improving over time. And then what we did was we gave them, we showed them a TED article, a video clip on the impact of advances in technology. And we said, okay, now look at what technology has done. For example, we looked at Jesse Owens, I presume was the US, in the 1936 Olympics in sprint, in the 100-metre sprint. He did it in 10.2 seconds, and he would have come last in the 2013 race with Usain Bolt, where he set a record of 9.77 seconds. But in 1936, Jesse Owens ran on a surface that was just wood ash or cinders, compared to Usain Bolt's track, which was a specially engineered carpet. And it said that had the guy in 1936, had he competed on that engineered carpet, he would have become very close to even beating Usain. So, and then we looked at, how they take into account body types and so on. So we looked at bringing in technology. How has technology helped advance athletics, athletes? And so then we said, let the selections begin. We want you to develop models for selecting swimming teams for the 2000 Olympics. So based on what they've done, we then narrowed it down to they had to select this. This was done about 12, 18 months ago before the 2000 Olympics, and they had to address, are Australian athletes also improving over time? Would Australia like to be likely to win the 2016 Olympics? And they realised they had to refine the questions. So we gave them some data, sets of data, and they had to develop a model for selecting Australia's 6 best swimmers to compete in either the women's or the men's 100-metre freestyle relay event in the Rio 2016 Olympics. And the model was to ensure Australia has the best chance of winning gold medal. And they had to report on what data did you use, how did you analyse your data, what swimmers did you select and why. And as you can appreciate, they all came up with different models of the team that they selected. And unfortunately, Australia didn't do as well in the swimming as you would have liked to. We were beaten by you guys again. But so it'll be interesting to see how, I've analysed some of their data to see whom they selected and what they took into account. When they reported on their models that they developed using the data, we want them to, how certain were you that the team you selected was the best team? And the model you've come up with, taking into account the data and the model you developed, could you apply that to other team selections? Now some students realised that they could to some teams, but in some of these sporting events they couldn't. Okay. I'll just show you a couple of snippets and I won't show you it all because it gets a bit boring, but this is a reporting on what they did. That's not going to work by the looks of it.
I'm really confident because we sort of, how in problem solving, how do you eliminate the possibilities? So that's what we were doing with the swimmers. And we really made sure that like they had the fastest time in events and they had the really good personal bests, and we compared personal bests, and we also saw the fastest in the events, and we could actually see that the data was true, so I'm really certain that this is.
For me, it was, I think for me it might have been a little simpler. We weren't given a great range of data, like it was it all fitted on one sheet, and so just looking at the fastest times and their personal best, you can easily see who's the fastest. So I'm confident in my answer, because unless there's been like one of the girls has had a lot of training over that time and they just excelled, like I doubt that will happen. So I'm pretty confident in my answer.
Also provoking another thing up. But you know how we listened to the TAD article?
TED.
Yeah. I also want to think that your body build also had something to do with the thing, and so once we got onto that, we could sort of.
Okay, I'll go to. Let me just. Oh, hang on. Wait a second. Let me get. I don't know whether it's the same one about how certain.
I'm really confident because we sort of, you know how problem solving, how you eliminate.
Oh, she just said that, hasn't she?
So that's what we played with these swimmers, and we really made sure that like they had the fastest time in events, and they had the really good personal bests, and we compared personal bests, and we also saw the fastest.
Yeah. Okay, I'll leave that one there. There was actually two, but not to worry. What we then did, once they had developed their model, they got up, they reported their models to the class, and we want them to critically provide constructive critical feedback. And one group was saying that they looked at the athletes' personal best times and how many times they'd been to a swimming race. So they looked at personal best and how many times there were different races that they had competed in. So the students, one student said, well, when you're talking about experience, what do you mean by that? Which is more important to you, the personal best, the speed, or the experience? So that were the sorts of questions we were trying to encourage the kids across the 3 years to ask critical questions about the models that they had developed. And then another one was reported and said, look, we're 75% confident that our team will win the 2016 Rio Olympics. And they come back and say, well, how do you know that? Because how can you be really, you don't really know you don't really have the teams and the times. How can you be any % sure? Another one, do you think your team selection would be, now this one group only took into account personal best times. I said, ignored all the other, let's just look at the personal best. And they said, well, shouldn't you take in more factors than just personal best? And they said, yes, the events like the competition events, so like the Olympics games. So the data had information on, how they performed in the Olympic Games, the Australian Swimming Championships, and they and the Commonwealth Games. They realised that comparing the Australian Championships with, say, the Olympics, you couldn't really, there are different levels of sophistication in the teams. So, okay, how does the type, where the race is held, how does that affect the racer? Swimmers, like athletes, can improve over time. So maybe we will look at the events because we think these swimmers could improve. And so another group comes back and says, well, so you could have considered the time they did the other races, the previous competitions, and made a better team. So that was just some examples of the responses that we're trying to get the students to be critical and constructive consumers of statistics when they develop their models, all the time bringing out the mathematics, looking at how they used it, looking at the different factors they need to take into consideration. And I suppose the beauty of modelling for me and with mathematics is that it enables all students to be involved. And just reading an article, I've actually made contact with a guy, George, what's his surname? I can never pronounce it. Anyway, he's just published a recent article in Natalie Sinclair's Journal of technology and mathematics education, I think it's called, and he was referring to computational thinking and young children. He gave a nice little, very simple framework where he looked at problems or activities that have low floor, high ceiling, wide walls, and conceptual surprise. Now, I love that little framework because I think with modelling, the beauty of modelling is that all students can enter modelling problems. So you've got students from, over the years, I find students that they say, teachers say, oh, I don't know how that child's going to go, is not terribly good at maths, and the teacher stands back and thinks, my goodness, with that modelling problem, that student has done really well because they're real world, they have multiple entry points, so students can come in at different levels, they can run with the data, it caters for, it's got a high ceiling, so the students can develop, become more sophisticated in their models, but, and different levels of sophistication doesn't necessarily apply they're better students, but different models, taking into account other factors. Wide walls, so the models that they create can be applied elsewhere, and conceptual surprise from our perspective, seeing what the students can generate, the mathematics they can generate, and from their own conceptual surprise. We've developed this model, we've found out that this is our team or whatever it might be. So the beauty of the modelling is that they are generative. In other words, we don't give the kids all the mathematics that they need. They draw the mathematics out of that. And I'm sure you've found that, for example, simple notions like mode, mean, and so on, students will use those before they've even been introduced to them. They know what range is. They understand those because of their everyday life. And we find and for example, I've even had students that have never been introduced to negative numbers. They will, looking at data, they'll weight data and they will assign 5 points, for example, if they've got a particular factor, 3 points if they haven't, and they decide they will add points or subtract points, they'll end up with negative numbers or whatever. And all the mathematics that comes out and the different models that are developed. So that's why I've been converted to different forms of mathematical modelling over many decades, as you can tell by my age. Okay, so just a few concluding points then. I think we need to look at the STEM acronym, stop these science people from taking it over. There's no science, but I do draw upon science, of course, science and mathematics in my engineering, but I just would like the STEM acronym just not to refer to science. Can we develop more unified perspectives on STEM? We might not be. And I think, as I said, raise the profile of mathematics and engineering. I think we need to keep abreast, obviously, of what's happening in the STEM agendas, the rise of computational thinking and coding, which I'm interested in. No doubt you're familiar with all the computational coding, but it's now, like once upon a time, it was just confined to computer courses. Now it's expanding and they're bringing in the mathematics, so there's a lot of overlap in the computational thinking, and it applies nicely to mathematics as well because statistics is an important component. There are shifts in industry and employer needs. In Australia, employers are saying, we want STEM skills. STEM skills go beyond just the disciplines. We want communication, we want 21st century skills and so on. So there's shifts in what employers want. What's happening globally. PISA, the fundamental mathematical capabilities, modelling is very important in the PISA categories. They are changing some of the contexts that they're looking at. Interdisciplinary and integrative perspectives, there are both positives and negatives in that. We can't let the maths get lost. And integrating, I'm all for integrate. Not everything. I mean, when I work with teachers, say you've got to teach the disciplines, you've got to teach your core content, but you can bring that together in projects, activities, which integrate those disciplines. As long as we make sure that maths just doesn't, get left on the wayside. And of course, obviously, professional development. And I've been learning a lot about immersion, the program that. Some of you are doing here, and the interactions you're working with teachers here is really great. And I'll just leave that and other recommendations because I'm keen to learn from you what you think about STEM, whether you have got STEM mania here in the US like we have in Australia. Okay, so I'll leave the floor open to any questions.